They were just kids, the teen soldiers of World War II. In the spring of 1944, 17-year-old Tommy Miller stood on the platform of a bustling train station in Chicago, his heart thudding with both pride and fear. His duffel bag, packed with a few belongings, and a photograph of his mother, hung from one shoulder. He wore a too-large uniform that made him look more like a boy playing dress-up than a soldier heading off to war. Tommy had lied about his age. He was only 16 when he enlisted, but the recruiting officer had barely looked at his forged birth certificate. They needed bodies. Boys were becoming men overnight, and the war machine had little time to question the youth of its fuel. His mother, Evelyn, hadn't known until she received the postcard 3 days after he'd already shipped out. He couldn't face her tears. His father had died in a mining accident 5 years earlier, and Tommy had felt the weight of being the man of the house since he was 11. "I'll make you proud, Ma," he had whispered as the train pulled away. The train lurched forward, and Tommy stumbled slightly, grabbing the back of a seat to steady himself. Around him, other young men in uniform sat with expressions ranging from excited bravado to quiet terror. Tommy found an empty window seat and watched as the Chicago skyline gradually faded into the distance. The buildings of his childhood grew smaller until they were just specks on the horizon, then disappeared entirely. He wondered if he'd ever see them again. In his pocket was a letter from his best friend Jimmy, who had enlisted 3 months earlier and was already somewhere in the Pacific. Jimmy's latest letter had been heavily censored, black lines obscuring most of the details. But his message was clear. "It ain't like the movies, Tommy." Now, as the countryside rushed past his window, Tommy wondered what exactly that meant. The journey to camp took nearly 14 hours. Tommy barely slept, his mind racing with visions of what lay ahead. By the time they arrived, his excitement had curdled into anxiety. The drill sergeant who greeted them didn't see children. He saw raw material to be shaped into weapons of war. "Forget who you were," the sergeant had bellowed. "From this moment, you belong to Uncle Sam." That night, lying on his bunk as the other recruits snored around him, Tommy stared at the ceiling and wondered if his mother had found his note yet. He'd left it tucked under her pillow, an apology and a promise. He closed his eyes and tried to remember the sound of her humming as she made breakfast on Sunday mornings. It was the last piece of home he would allow himself to hold on to. Tommy was assigned to the 101st Airborne Division, and after weeks of grueling training in Georgia's muggy heat, he found himself bunking with a group of equally young recruits. There was Frankie DeLuca from Brooklyn, fast-talking and always ready with a joke. Darnell Jackson, a quiet but kind black teenager from Alabama who faced double battles, one against the enemy and one within the ranks. And Charlie Beck, the farm boy from Iowa who had never been farther than the county line. They were kids, barely shaving, missing home-cooked meals, clutching good luck charms, and writing letters in shaky handwriting. But the world didn't see them that way. The world needed warriors. They trained like their lives depended on it. Because they did, Frankie kept morale high with his endless stories about the girls back in Brooklyn who were supposedly pining for his return. "Especially Sophia Marchetti," he'd say with a wink. "Her father hates me, which only makes her want me more." Nobody believed him, but his tales provided much-needed distraction from their aching muscles and blistered feet. Charlie proved to be surprisingly resilient for a farm boy. His years of hard labor had prepared him for the physical demands of training. "Ain't much different than harvesting season," he'd say, helping Tommy up after a particularly brutal obstacle course, "except the corn don't shoot back." Darnell kept mostly to himself at first. The segregation within the camps was unofficial but palpable. He ate meals alone until Tommy invited him to join their table. Some of the other soldiers glared, but Tommy stared them down. "He's one of us," Tommy had said simply. Gradually, Darnell opened up, sharing stories of his family's small farm and his dreams of becoming a teacher after the war. Their days blurred together in a haze of marching drills, weapons training, and parachute jumps. The first time Tommy jumped from a plane, he vomited immediately upon landing. Frankie never let him forget it. "At least you waited until you hit the ground," Charlie had consoled him. Jenkins emptied his stomach mid-air. At night, they'd sit together cleaning their rifles, each lost in his own thoughts of home. Darnell taught them songs his grandmother sang in church. Charlie showed them how to play poker using matchsticks instead of money. Tommy shared the cookies his mother sent, carefully rationing them to make them last. On their last night before shipping out, none of them could sleep. Tommy found Frankie sitting outside their barracks, smoking a cigarette with shaking hands. "You scared?" Tommy asked, sitting beside him. "Terrified," Frankie admitted, dropping his usual bravado. "My old man fought in the Great War, came back different, never talked about it." He took a long drag. "What if we don't come back at all?" Tommy had no answer. Instead, he pulled out the photo of his mother and showed it to Frankie. "I told her I'd come home." "Then you better keep your promise," Frankie said, patting him on the shoulder. "We all got to keep our promises." By morning, they were on their way to the European theatre. The journey across the Atlantic took 11 days. Seasickness plagued many of the men, but Tommy found he had decent sea legs. He spent hours on deck, watching the endless expanse of water and wondering if, somewhere on another ocean, Jimmy was doing the same. June 6, 1944. Tommy was among the thousands dropped behind enemy lines during the D-Day invasion. The C-47 aircraft roared with turbulence and nerves. Tommy clutched his parachute cord like a lifeline, staring at the red jump light. "We're gonna make history, boys," Frankie shouted over the engine's roar. The light turned green. Tommy jumped. He plummeted into the chaos of war, bullets zipping through the night, fires dotting the horizon, screams echoing through hedgerows. He landed in a ditch near Sainte-Mère-Église, his leg twisted but not broken. Alone and disoriented, he crawled through the brush, dodging enemy patrols. Hours later, he found Charlie, his helmet cracked but still breathing, and together they made their way toward the objective. They weren't just playing war anymore. They were the war. The sky had been black when they jumped, illuminated only by sporadic explosions and the white streaks of tracer fire. Tommy's parachute had deployed perfectly, but the winds had carried him far from his designated drop zone. As he drifted downward, he saw other paratroopers scattered across the Norman countryside like dandelion seeds blown in a gale. The moment his feet touched ground, Tommy scrambled to detach his parachute harness. His training took over. Collect the chute, hide it, orient yourself, find your unit. But in the darkness and confusion, none of it was as simple as it had been during drills. His leg throbbed from the awkward landing, but adrenaline dulled the pain. Tommy checked his weapon, made sure it was loaded, and began moving cautiously through the unfamiliar terrain. Every shadow might be an enemy. Every sound could mean death. For 3 terrifying hours, Tommy navigated through hedgerows and fields, stopping frequently to listen. Twice he had to dive for cover as German patrols passed nearby. Once he lay face down in a muddy ditch for nearly 40 minutes as soldiers conversed in German just meters away, their cigarettes glowing in the darkness. When he finally found Charlie, it was pure luck. He nearly shot him, mistaking his movement for an enemy soldier. Charlie had been hiding in an abandoned barn, tending to a gash on his forehead where his helmet had split upon landing. "Thought you were a goner," Charlie whispered, his voice shaky with relief. "Have you seen the others?" Tommy asked. Charlie shook his head. "We're scattered all over. I ran into Peters from D Company, says most of us missed the drop zones by miles." They decided to move toward their objective, a small bridge that needed to be secured before dawn. Along the way, they collected 2 more paratroopers from their division. By sunrise, they had linked up with a lieutenant from another company who took command of their makeshift squad. The bridge was heavily defended. Tommy fired his rifle in combat for the first time that morning, the kickback bruising his shoulder. He couldn't tell if he hit anyone. Part of him hoped he hadn't. By midday, reinforcements arrived, and they pushed forward into the town. Tommy saw his first dead German soldier, a boy who looked no older than himself, his glassy eyes staring at the sky. Later, he helped carry a wounded American captain to an aid station set up in a bombed-out church. The captain's legs had been shredded by mortar fire. He died before they reached the medics. That night, exhausted beyond measure, Tommy finally found Frankie among a group of paratroopers regrouping near a captured German bunker. Frankie's face was streaked with dirt and blood. Not his own, he assured Tommy, but his grin was the same as ever. "Some entrance we made, huh?" Frankie said, pulling Tommy into a fierce hug. "Told you we'd make history." Tommy couldn't respond. The weight of the day, the fear, the death, the overwhelming sensory assault of battle had robbed him of words. Instead, he simply nodded and took the cigarette Frankie offered, his hand trembling as he raised it to his lips. They sat together in silence as night fell over Normandy, the distant rumble of artillery like summer thunder. They were 17 years old, thousands of miles from home, and the war had only just begun. A week later, they took a farmhouse outside Carentan. A family had been hiding in the basement, 2 children and their elderly grandmother. The kids reminded Tommy of his younger sister back home. While guarding the perimeter, Tommy saw Darnell gunned down while pulling a wounded soldier to safety. He died in Tommy's arms, blood soaking into the dirt, eyes wide with shock. "I just wanted to make it home," Darnell whispered. Tommy didn't know what to say. He'd never seen a man die before, but Darnell wasn't a man. He was a kid who had volunteered for a country that barely saw him as equal. The gravity of war weighed heavier with each passing day. The farmhouse had been a strategic position, overlooking a crucial crossroads. Intelligence suggested German forces were using it as an observation post. Tommy's squad had approached under cover of darkness, moving silently through apple orchards until they reached the stone walls surrounding the property. The assault had been quick. They breached the doors, tossed in smoke grenades, and swept through room by room. They found 2 German soldiers, both dead from the initial barrage. What they hadn't expected were the civilians. The family had been huddled in the root cellar for days. The grandmother, stooped and frail, had defiantly stood in front of her grandchildren when the Americans burst in. Her eyes had flashed with a mixture of fear and determination as she spoke rapidly in French. It was Charlie who managed to communicate with her, his high school French rusty, but sufficient to assure her they meant no harm. The children, a boy of about 9 and a girl perhaps 6, stared at the American soldiers with wide eyes. The little girl clutched a dirty rag doll to her chest. When Tommy offered her a piece of chocolate from his rations, she had hesitated, then accepted it with a tiny merci. For 3 days, they held the farmhouse, turning it into a temporary command post. The family remained in the cellar for safety, but the children would occasionally venture upstairs, curious about the young soldiers. The little girl, Marie, had taken a particular liking to Darnell, who carved tiny wooden animals for her from fallen branches. "My sister collects these back home," he explained to Tommy as he worked on a small bird. Figured it might make things less scary for the kid. The attack came on the 3rd day. A German counteroffensive targeted the crossroads. Mortar shells began falling around the farmhouse. Tommy and Frankie had been positioned in an upstairs window when the first shells hit. They raced downstairs to ensure the family was secure in the cellar. That's when Sergeant Willis took a bullet through the shoulder as he ran for cover near the western wall. He lay exposed in the yard, blood pooling beneath him, moaning for help. Darnell had been the first to react. "Cover me," he shouted, and before anyone could stop him, he sprinted out into the yard. Tommy and Frankie immediately laid down suppressing fire toward the tree line where the shots had come from. Darnell reached the sergeant and began dragging him toward the barn. They had almost made it to safety when the sniper found his mark. 3 shots, 1 to Darnell's leg, 1 to his side, and the final fatal shot to his chest. Tommy ran out, ignoring the captain's orders to stay put. He reached Darnell just as the light began to fade from his eyes. Cradling his friend's head, Tommy felt the warm blood seeping through his uniform. Darnell's breathing came in ragged gasps. "Tell my mama I wasn't afraid," Darnell managed, his voice barely audible above the ongoing gunfire. "I just wanted to make it home." Then his body went slack, eyes fixed on the cloudy Norman sky. Tommy sat there, holding him, until Frankie pulled him back to safety. Sergeant Willis survived, evacuated to a field hospital hours later. But Darnell Jackson, 18 years old, who wanted to be a teacher, who carved wooden animals for a scared French girl who faced discrimination at home and death abroad, was gone. That night, after they had wrapped Darnell's body in his own blanket and marked the spot where they would bury him come morning, Tommy sat alone behind the barn and cried for the first time since leaving home. Charlie found him there and simply sat beside him in silence, offering a flask of whiskey the captain had shared with them. I keep thinking about what he said, Tommy finally spoke, wiping his face with his sleeve. About wanting to make it home. What are we even doing here, Charlie? We're just kids. I don't know, Charlie admitted, but Darnell saved Willis, that's something. Is it enough? Tommy asked. To die for? Charlie had no answer. None of them did. But the war demanded answers in blood, whether they were ready to provide them or not. Back at camp, Tommy began writing letters he'd never send. To his mother, I miss the way you made cornbread on Sundays. I miss the quiet of home. To Darnell's mother, your son died a hero, but he shouldn't have had to die at all. To himself, I'm scared I won't come back the same. I'm scared I won't come back at all. These weren't things boys should have to think about. But they did. They all did. The camp was a temporary respite from the constant forward push. They'd been given 3 days to resupply, integrate replacement troops, and rest. Though rest was a luxury few could truly embrace. The memories were too fresh, the sounds of battle still ringing in their ears, even in silence. Tommy had found an old notebook in an abandoned schoolhouse during their advance. Its pages were blank, the previous owner having either fled or met a fate Tommy tried not to contemplate. He took to writing in it during quiet moments, a way to process what he was experiencing without burdening his fellow soldiers. He wrote extensively to his mother, telling her the things he couldn't include in his official letters home, how the constant dampness of Normandy had given him a persistent cough, how he'd developed a superstitious habit of touching the photo of her before each mission, how he sometimes forgot what their kitchen looked like but could still remember the exact smell of her perfume. I saw a woman in a village yesterday who reminded me of you, he wrote. She was hanging laundry as we marched past. For a second I almost waved, thinking somehow you'd gotten here ahead of me. Isn't that stupid? I miss you so much my brain plays tricks on me. His letters to Darnell's mother were the hardest to write. The official notification she would receive would be sterile, bureaucratic. A form letter signed by someone who had never met her son. Tommy wanted her to know the Darnell he had known, the young man who hummed church hymns while cleaning his rifle, who had once given his entire chocolate ration to a hungry French child, who had spoken with such hope about becoming a teacher after the war. Your son saved a man's life, Tommy wrote. Sergeant Willis has a wife and 3 kids back in Missouri who still have their father because of Darnell. I wish that made it hurt less. I wish I could tell you he didn't suffer, but I won't lie to you. His last thoughts were of you and home. Some pages were filled with drawings, crude sketches of the French countryside, of their temporary camps, of Frankie laughing or Charlie sleeping against his pack. Tommy had never considered himself an artist, but the act of recording what he saw helped anchor him to reality when everything felt increasingly surreal. The letters to himself were the most honest. Confessions of fear, of doubt, of the growing numbness he felt after each engagement. Questions about God, about purpose, about whether anything would ever feel normal again. I killed a man yesterday, he wrote after a particularly fierce skirmish in a small village. Up close, I could see his eyes. He looked younger than me. I keep telling myself it was him or me, but that doesn't help when I try to sleep. Does this change who I am? Am I still Tommy Miller from Chicago, or am I becoming someone else entirely? Other men had different ways of coping. Frankie collected souvenirs, harmless ones like foreign coins or buttons, not the macabre trophies some soldiers took from the dead. Charlie wrote poetry, surprisingly delicate verses that contrasted sharply with his sturdy farmer's hands. Their new squad mate, Rodriguez, prayed the rosary each night, the beads clicking softly in the darkness. One evening, as they sat around a small fire outside their tents, Frankie nudged Tommy's shoulder. What's with the notebook? You writing the next great American novel? Tommy shrugged. Just thoughts, things I can't say out loud. Frankie nodded, understanding. My old man never talked about the Great War. Not once. Now I get why. He stared into the flames. Some things you can't explain to folks who weren't here. What'll you tell them when you get home? Charlie asked, looking up from cleaning his weapon. Frankie's usual grin faltered. That I did my duty. That's all they need to know. Tommy closed his notebook and tucked it into his jacket pocket, close to his heart. These words, these truths, They belonged only to those who had earned the right to hear them, those who had been there, those who understood that war wasn't just fighting. It was a transformation of the soul. The Battle of the Bulge hit like a hammer. In the frozen forests of Bastogne, Tommy and the rest of the 101st dug in and waited. Snow fell endlessly. Rations ran low. Frostbite nipped at fingers and toes. The Germans shelled them day and night. Charlie lost his hearing in one ear from a blast. Frankie caught shrapnel in the shoulder and refused evacuation. "I ain't letting you get all the glory," he joked, wincing. They huddled together for warmth, for courage, for sanity. Tommy shared chocolate from a ration pack he had saved for Christmas. "Merry freaking Christmas," he muttered. December had descended with brutal indifference to human suffering. The temperature dropped well below freezing, and the snow deepened by the hour. Their foxholes, laboriously dug into the frozen ground, offered minimal protection from the elements and the constant barrage of German artillery. Tommy had never known cold like this. It seeped into his bones, made his joints ache, numbed his thoughts. They rotated socks, one pair worn, one pair drying against their bodies, a desperate attempt to stave off trench foot. Some men lost toes anyway. Others developed hacking coughs that sprayed blood onto the pristine snow. The siege of Bastogne tested them in ways D-Day hadn't. This wasn't rapid movement and adrenaline-fueled combat. This was endurance, patience, and the daily battle against despair. They were surrounded, cut off from supplies, told to hold at all costs. When the German commander sent a message demanding their surrender, their general had famously replied with one word: nuts. The men found grim humor in this, repeating it to each other like a talisman whenever morale dipped. "They want us to surrender," Frankie had said through chattering teeth. "Nuts to that." The shelling was relentless. It came in waves, sometimes lasting hours. They learned to tell from the sound where the shells would land. A useless skill most days, as there was nowhere to run anyway. During one particularly heavy bombardment, Charlie had been manning their machine gun position when a shell exploded nearby. The concussion threw him against the edge of the foxhole. When he came to, blood trickled from his left ear, and that side of his world had gone silent. "Consider it a blessing," Frankie had joked, his voice strained with his own pain. "Now you only have to listen to half my bullshit." Frankie's injury had come 2 days later. A shell fragment tore through his shoulder while he was retrieving water. The medic wanted to evacuate him to a field hospital, but transport was scarce, and Frankie refused. "It's just a scratch," he insisted, though the wound was deep enough to reveal bone. The medic cleaned it as best he could and packed it with sulfur powder, but infection was a constant threat in these conditions. Tommy found himself becoming the caretaker for his friends. He changed Frankie's bandages, helped Charlie orient himself when his damaged equilibrium made movement difficult, and took extra shifts on watch to allow them more rest. The roles they'd established in training had shifted. Tommy, once the uncertain one, now projected a calm competence that belied his inner turmoil. Food became an obsession. Their K-rations, designed for short periods, had been stretched thin. They melted snow for water and talked endlessly about meals from home. Charlie described in mouth-watering detail his mother's fried chicken and mashed potatoes. Frankie rhapsodized about his grandmother's homemade pasta. Tommy closed his eyes and could almost taste his mother's apple pie. Christmas Eve arrived with no respite from the shelling or the cold. Tommy had been saving a chocolate bar from a package his mother had sent months ago. He'd carried it through France, through Belgium, a tangible connection to home. That night, in their crowded, frozen foxhole, he broke it into pieces and shared it with Frankie, Charlie, and 2 replacement soldiers who had joined their unit just before the German offensive. "Merry Christmas, you sorry bastards," he said, passing the fragments around. "Some Christmas," one of the new guys muttered, a skinny kid from Minnesota who couldn't have been more than 18. "Could be worse," Charlie said, his voice pitched louder than necessary due to his hearing loss. "Could be the Germans." They laughed, a small, fragile sound in the vastness of the frozen forest. For a moment, Tommy could almost pretend they were just boys on a camping trip, sharing stories in the cold. Then the artillery started again, and reality crashed back upon them. That night, as Frankie shivered with fever beside him and Charlie kept watch, Tommy pulled out his notebook. His fingers were so cold he could barely hold the pencil, but he managed to write, Christmas Eve, 1944. Still alive, still holding. Don't know if that's victory or just prolonging the inevitable. Missing home so bad it feels like another kind of wound. If I make it through this winter, I swear I'll never complain about Chicago's cold again. In the distance, through breaks in the artillery fire, Tommy thought he could hear German voices singing Silent Night in their native tongue. The melody was the same, even if the words were those of the enemy. For a fleeting moment, he wondered if somewhere in the German lines, another young soldier was writing in his own journal, missing his own home just as desperately. The thought didn't make Tommy hate them less, but it reminded him of a shared humanity that the war seemed determined to make them forget. The war dragged into 1945. Towns were liberated, concentration camps were discovered. The smell of death hung in the air like fog. Tommy stood at the gates of Buchenwald and vomited. Nothing in basic training had prepared them for the reality of genocide. Starved eyes stared back at them. Tommy gave away his rations, unsure whether he was feeding the living or delaying the dying. This was no longer about glory. This was about humanity. He'd left home a boy with dreams of heroism. He was now a man carrying nightmares. The push through Germany brought victories, but each step deeper into the Third Reich revealed new horrors. Towns and cities lay in ruins from Allied bombing. Civilians, mostly women, children, and the elderly, emerged from cellars with hollow eyes and raised hands, terrified of the American soldiers who had been portrayed as monsters in Nazi propaganda. Tommy's unit advanced steadily eastward. Frankie's shoulder had healed poorly, leaving him with limited mobility in his right arm. But he adapted. Charlie's hearing never returned in his left ear, something he claimed gave him a tactical advantage. I can sleep through Frankie's snoring if I lay on my good ear. The three of them had become the veterans in their squad, the ones new replacements looked to for guidance. Tommy found it strange to be considered experienced at 18. Sometimes he caught glimpses of his reflection in broken windows or still ponds, and barely recognized the gaunt, weathered face staring back. They had just crossed into central Germany when their convoy was diverted to a place called Buchenwald. Rumors had been circulating among the troops for days about what Allied forces were discovering as they pushed deeper into Germany, but nothing prepared them for the reality. The stench reached them before the camp came into view, the unmistakable odor of death and disease. As they approached the gates, Tommy saw the words "Jedem das Sein" wrought in iron. To each what they deserve. Inside was hell on earth. Skeletal figures in striped uniforms shuffled about, or lay motionless on wooden bunks stacked 3 high. The dead lay where they had fallen, too numerous for the living to remove. Some prisoners approached the American soldiers with outstretched hands, touching their uniforms as if to confirm they were real. Tommy made it about 50 yards inside before his body rebelled. He turned away from his squad and vomited until there was nothing left but bile. When he straightened, he saw he wasn't alone. Hardened veterans were weeping openly. Others were retching just as he had been. A prisoner approached Tommy, a man of indeterminate age, his head shaved, his frame so emaciated that each bone was visible through his skin. He spoke in accented English. "You are American?" Tommy nodded, unable to find his voice. "I was professor in Vienna, before." The man gestured vaguely at the camp around them. "They took us because we spoke against them. Then they took others because of what they believed. Then they took more because of who they were born as." His eyes, deep in skeletal sockets, fixed on Tommy's. "You understand why you fight now, yes?" Tommy did understand, with a clarity that was almost painful. This war wasn't about territory or power or even ideology. It was about preventing the complete annihilation of human dignity. He reached into his pack and pulled out his day's rations, offering them to the professor. "Please," he said, finding his voice, "take it." The man hesitated. "There are children here, hidden. The SS would kill them first when food was scarce." Tommy nodded. "For the children, then." The professor took the rations with trembling hands and shuffled away. Throughout the camp, other soldiers were doing the same, emptying their packs, giving away cigarettes, chocolate, anything they had. Medics were already setting up triage stations, though they were woefully unprepared for the scale of suffering before them. That night, Tommy's unit camped just outside the perimeter. No one spoke much. Even Frankie's usual stream of jokes and stories had dried up in the face of what they had witnessed. Tommy sat against a tree, his notebook open but empty. What words could possibly capture this? What language existed to describe such systematic cruelty? Charlie sat beside him, his good ear turned toward Tommy. "You know what gets me?" he said quietly. "We're the same age as some of them in there. We could have been them if we'd been born somewhere else." Tommy nodded. The randomness of fate had never seemed so stark. Born in Chicago instead of Krakow. Born to one religion instead of another. These accidents of birth determined who lived, who died, who suffered, who inflicted suffering. "I used to think about going home as a hero," Tommy finally said. "Now I just want to go home knowing we stopped this. That's enough." They stayed at Buchenwald for 3 days, helping the medical teams and military government officials who arrived to begin the enormous task of caring for the survivors. Tommy worked until he was dead on his feet, distributing food, carrying the sick to medical tents, digging graves for those who didn't survive liberation. When they finally received orders to move out, to continue the advance eastward, Tommy felt both relief and a strange reluctance. Leaving felt like abandonment, though he knew others would continue the work they had begun. As their trucks pulled away, Tommy looked back at the camp that had forever changed him. He was no longer fighting for abstract concepts like freedom or democracy. He was fighting because he had seen the face of evil, and to do nothing in its presence would be to surrender his own humanity. He had arrived in Europe a boy playing at being a soldier. He was leaving Buchenwald a man who understood exactly why that role had been thrust upon him. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, Tommy sat alone on a grassy hill outside a small village in eastern France, watching colourful fireworks burst and bloom above a recently liberated town. The distant celebration echoed across the valley like artillery fire, making his shoulders tense with each explosion. The sky was clear that night, scattered with stars that had witnessed everything. He wondered if the same stars shone over Chicago. Frankie had survived, though his left arm would never work quite right again after catching shrapnel outside Bastogne. But Charlie didn't make it out of the Ardennes. The forest had claimed him during those frozen weeks when death came silently in the snow. He was buried beneath a makeshift wooden cross, marked only with his dog tags and a creased photograph of his golden retriever back home. Tommy had promised to visit Charlie's mother when he returned, dreading the conversation more than any battlefield. As spring bloomed across the war-torn countryside, Tommy found himself processing paperwork, waiting endlessly in lines, watching as the great machine that had brought them to war now struggled to send them home. The days blurred together in a haze of cigarette smoke and bad coffee. Tommy boarded the ship home in silence, leaning against the railing as Europe's coastline disappeared into the horizon. The Atlantic crossing was mercifully uneventful, just the rhythmic churning of engines and the quiet conversations of men who had seen too much, now desperately trying to remember who they had been before. When he stepped off the train at Chicago's Union Station, his mother waited on the platform with open arms, her face lined with years of worry. He didn't cry, though he had imagined this moment 1,000 times in foxholes and field hospitals. He just held her for a long time, breathing in the familiar scent of her perfume, feeling smaller and larger than himself all at once. "You're so grown," she whispered, pulling back to study his face, touching the new scar along his jaw. "I was just trying to make it home, Ma," he replied, carrying his duffel bag with one hand, offering her his arm with the other. They walked together into a world that had continued spinning without him, the city streets both familiar and strangely new, as if he were seeing everything through borrowed eyes. Years passed. Tommy married Eleanor, a nurse he met at a community dance in '46. They had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, and bought a modest house in the same neighborhood where he'd grown up. He used the GI Bill to finish college and became a history teacher at the local high school. The nightmares came less frequently as time passed, though certain sounds, firecrackers on the 4th of July, car backfires, thunder on summer nights, could still send him diving for cover, much to his children's confusion. He rarely spoke of the war, keeping those memories locked away, like the medals in his dresser drawer. The exception was when the curious boys in his history class would discover he'd been there, really there, when they reached the World War II unit. Their textbooks contained sterile maps and cold statistics that couldn't possibly capture what he'd seen. During those rare moments of openness, he would carefully unfold a worn photograph he kept in his wallet. It showed him and Frankie, impossibly young, smiling in front of a mud-splattered jeep somewhere in France. Their helmets were tilted at jaunty angles, cigarettes dangling from their lips in practiced nonchalance. No hint of the terror they'd felt just hours before or would feel again soon after. "We were just kids," he'd say, his voice growing softer as the students leaned forward in their seats. "Not much older than you. We didn't know anything about the world." After class, he would sometimes take them outside to the granite memorial that stood in the town square. His finger would trace the names etched in stone, pausing at Darnell Washington, the boy from his neighborhood who never made it past the beaches, whose mother still left flowers every Sunday. "Don't ever forget the names of the boys who paid the price," he would tell them. "History isn't just dates and battles, it's people." At night, he would sometimes write letters to Frankie, who had settled in Pennsylvania. They exchanged Christmas cards and occasional phone calls, their friendship stretching across miles, but holding steady through marriages, children, promotions, and losses. In 1984, 40 years after D-Day, Tommy stood on the windswept cliffs of Normandy with Frankie. Both were grey-haired now, their postures slightly stooped, walking with canes instead of rifles. But their bond hadn't aged a day. The water below was calm and blue, nothing like the crimson-tinged waves they remembered from that June morning when the world held its breath. They had brought their wives this time, and some of their grown children. The younger generation wandered among the pristine rows of white crosses, trying to comprehend the magnitude of what had happened here before they were born. "We made it, didn't we?" Frankie said, brushing a tear from his eye with an arthritic hand. The wind carried away his words almost as soon as they were spoken. Tommy nodded, feeling the weight of all those who hadn't stood here today, Charlie, Darnell, countless others whose faces still visited him in dreams. "We were just kids, but we did what we had to do." They stood in silence for a long moment, listening to the waves crash against the shore, feeling the presence of ghosts all around them. Tommy's grandson, a teenager with his grandmother's gentle eyes, approached cautiously and stood beside them, sensing something profound but unable to fully grasp it. "What was it like?" the boy asked quietly. "Were you scared?" Tommy placed a weathered hand on the boy's shoulder. "Terrified," he admitted, "but sometimes being brave isn't about not being scared, it's about being scared and moving forward anyway." As they walked slowly back to the tour bus, Tommy realized that they had left behind more than their innocence in Europe's muddy fields and snow-covered forests. They had left their youth, their simplicity, parts of themselves that could never be reclaimed. But they had come home with something stronger. Brotherhood forged in fire, memory that would outlast them, and a quiet understanding that sometimes the bravest among us are those with the least time lived, those whose names are carved in stone instead of allowed to age with dignity. Frankie stopped to rest on a bench overlooking the beach. "Do you think they know?" he asked, gesturing toward the tourists snapping photos. "Do you think they understand what happened here?" "Some do," Tommy replied, "and that's why we came back, to remember for those who can't."